In the next 45 minutes, I should like to change the world. Just a little. I should like to convince you that the Battle of Brunanburh in the year 937, in which Athelstan, king of the West Saxons, crushed an invading force of Scots and Strathclyders and Viking Irish, was near the town of Lanchester in County Durham, and not, as is said by very many people, at Bromborough in the Wirral Peninsula. Now, I knew that this question would be controversial, but I did not realize how controversial until I received this book, hot from the press. It arrived 48 hours ago at my house in Pamplona by Tim Clarkson, Strathclyde and the Anglo-Saxons in the Viking Age. I recommend this book, although the author is completely wrong in everything he says about the Battle of Brunanburh. Nevertheless, it shows we are dealing with an archaeological and historical and philological hot potato. What I should like to say in that 45 minutes, first of all, to review some opinions on the location of Brunanburh over the last 500 years or so, and then to say why I am so sure that it was fought in a remote spot by the modern town of Lanchester in County Durham in the August or September of the year 937. And at the end of it all, I would allow it to have a few more surprises, particularly for the archaeologists in our midst, on what philology can do to forward the work of archaeology on locations of battles and other historic sites in early England and Wales. I shall be mentioning the name of St. Patrick and also the name of King Arthur, but very briefly, because we know Arthur is not entirely a historical figure. All right, the Battle of Brunanburh. All histories of the Anglo-Saxons comment upon this crushing event. The Hastings of the 10th century is one description of it. And it appears not only in every modern historian who has dealt with this period, but also with a great deal of medieval material, Welsh chronicles, Scandinavian saga, material from Anglo-Saxon England in Latin and in Old English. There is no doubt of the impact it had, its fame for contemporaries and for the generations that came after. But the vexed question has been, where was it? And discussion of this point has gone on for some 500 years, since that great antiquary John Leland, in the time of Henry VIII, put his proposal forward. He thought it was near Axminster, down in the southwest. Nobody, needless to say, has followed him on that one. And if we look at the great edition, a classic edition, one of the most extraordinary editions of any Old English poem ever to be published, Alistair Campbell's edition of the Battle of Brunanburh, the poetic text in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which is our main source for the battle, in his introduction. This is work of 1938, but it is as valuable now as it was the day it was published. He goes through an immense variety of places that have been suggested, with the somewhat sardonic comment that most of these proposals are totally worthless, and coming to the somewhat pessimistic conclusion, which is an honest one and a brave one, and makes one think more highly of him as a scholar. He says, unless we take some evidence from Egil's saga, which is dubious in itself, we should probably find it is better to abandon it. And abandon it we must. All hope, he said in 1938, of localizing Brunanburh is lost. Unless new evidence can be produced, an honest nescio, I do not know, is greatly to be preferred to ambitious localizations built upon sand. Now, that very honest, brave, and scholarly comment has not, however, been taken entirely serious by other scholars. And many of you will be aware that, following a suggestion of Professor Hugh Smith of University College London in the 1930s, many recent scholars have argued unexceptionable, one cannot disprove it. Brunanburh would give Bromborough in modern English. The problem is there isn't a slightest scrap of other evidence to put this place in the Wirral, though this is a notion, as I found in a previous lecture I gave last March in Huddersfield, that is still vigorously opposed by the defenders of the Bromborough school. Right. I notice, however, going through the criticism of this subject, that some of the wisest scholars of Anglo-Saxon England, Frank Stenton and Dorothy Whitelock in particular, refrained from naming any particular place for the site of this battle, a crucial battle in the unification of England, because the West Saxons fought with Mercians under Athelstan's command. Right. Since September last year, I received a message from an independent scholar called Kevin Halloran, who lives in North Lancashire, and he had seen publications of mine in the Journal of Literary Onomastics, edited by Stefan Jurasinski of Brockport University, USA. And since he had himself published on the Battle of Brunanburh, he asked me my opinion. And I was not particularly pleased to have this email inquiry, because I took the view that nobody was ever going to find out where Brunanburh was. If nobody had found it, it was logically obvious that nobody was ever going to find it. However, feeling that I ought to do something about his question, I went to Campbell's edition. And on page 61, I found a footnote, a very interesting and detailed footnote, in which he makes the comment that Brunna would be the name of the River Brownie in County Durham, as the early Middle English forms show. And, Campbell says, other streams may have had the same name. In 1938, he was so near, and yet so far. But reading that, I reached for my trusty archaic technology, a 1-inch Ordnance Survey map, bought for 70 pence in 1976, and started looking for this River Brownie, of which I had never previously heard. There it is, running down from the Pennine Hills and joining the River Wear near Durham. And looking at the map with this most elementary of archaeological techniques, I thought, well, if there was a battle, presumably it was on a Roman road running north. And I followed with my finger the Roman road, and the Roman road which you see there, running north from Cataractonium, or Catterick, up to Hadrian's Wall. And what I found, now what do I do with this thing? I just press the next thing, and what I found was that. You see the Roman road, those dotted lines running south to north. You see the River Brownie running west to east, and half a mile north of the Brownie is the Roman fort of Longo Uigi. An Anglo-Saxon would call a defence of that kind a burgh, a stronghold, as in Borough Castle near Lowestoft in East Anglia, or Richborough near Sandwich in East Kent. And therefore, it seemed to be as obvious as the nose in front of one's face that this is the certain and veritable site of the Battle of Brunanburh, the fortress by the Brunna, the fortress by the River Brownie. And when one looks at the evidence given to us by early chroniclers and modern discussion of them, one's confidence becomes still more assured. Because you do not need to be Clausewitz to see that any general who took a Scottish Strathclyde Viking army to the Wirral Peninsula for embarkation would be putting his head into a noose, would be putting his army into a death trap. Whereas the Roman roads of northern England were used in Roman times, in Anglo-Saxon times, they were exceedingly useful for the English when they came to invade Scotland, and equally so for the Blue Bonnets when they came south to invade England. I actually visited Lanchester in November last year. A report was published in the Darlington paper, the Northern Echo, and the local historians of Lanchester took me to the site. The landowner there showed me the fort and gave me some extremely intelligent and interesting comments on it. And if you have looked at the photograph on the website of the society, you will see him and me, and there I am pointing and saying, on that road in August or September of 937 there came the armies of Scotland, the hosts of the Scots and the Strathclyders, and it was here that they met their doom. All the evidence one can find points towards a single conclusion. For example, the different historians of the period have much to say about the battle. John of Worcester tells us that the invaders came in rather unexpectedly on the east coast through the Humber. Now this has been bitterly denied indeed. Tim Clarkson in this very book will not have it. He thinks that if you're going to invade, the Vikings are going to invade Britain, you rely on the west coast, but it is exceedingly dangerous to ignore the statements of those who were in a position to get the facts and so on. If the battle was at Lanchester, an east coast situation, the invading hosts having no doubt plundered York and other places to their heart's content, it all fits. And then we look at the comments of other historians. William of Malmesbury is one amongst those who mentions the battle, but the most detailed account comes from Simeon of Durham. And he not only gives us the form Brunanburh, which I interpret as the fortress by the River Brownie, he also refers to the hill as Wenduna, means the round hill, the sphere, the circular-shaped hill. Take it for my word, that describes precisely the ridge on which Brunanburh, the fort of Lanchester, is to be found, and so on. And I put it to you, Simeon of Durham, it is no surprise that he should give us so much detail on locations associated with the battle, because he was writing only 8 miles away from where it was fought. He was in a position to know the facts. The advocates of the Bromborough school in Cheshire, Dodson, place name scholars amongst them, make great emphasis of the form of the name, and yet no historian refers to the Vikings as making their escape by boat, which would be curious, but makes perfect sense if the location was an inland one, as I put it to you. And I have a final point. If you are the general of a Scots army invading England, as so many of us are from time to time, it makes a lot of sense to move men and materials, the logistics of it all, by the roads that there are to hand. This was the way Scots armies travelled right up until 1745 and bonnie Prince Charlie. If anybody has information on a Scots army arriving or departing, returning to Scotland by boat, then I should be very interested to hear of it. But so far I know none. I take it that the Scots retreated along those roads, and it was on one of those roads that Athelstan made his counterattack and achieved victory in a bloody battle. We have reports on the number of kings, princes, and earls who lay dead on the soil of the battlefield by the end of that day. Right, that is my argument. It is controversial, but I am confident in it. I stick to it. The reports of the visit to the local archaeologists, and indeed the conference that we had on this subject at Huddersfield last March, taught me a great deal about the difficulties and the expectations of archaeology, because it was made very clear to me, as many of you need no telling, that pre-modern battles leave very little in terms of archaeological traces. Only the invention of the gun and of lead bullets make modern battles so much easier to trace than was the case for medieval battles. The material of war, spears, arrows, swords, decay. It is exceedingly difficult. Those of you who are familiar with what Glenn Ford did for the heroic efforts whereby he was able to find the exact site of the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485 will be fully informed upon the difficulties that attend anybody who is seeking to locate the material of battle in the vicinity of Lanchester. Now, having said all this, a few weeks ago I had a message from Peter France, just to jaunt my complacency, who is responsible for archaeological excavations in the Wirral. And he said, "I'm sorry I cannot come to your paper, but we've been finding some very interesting Viking Age remains up here in the Wirral." He said, "We've been finding arrowheads, we've been finding organic material, we've been finding bones of people who, it seems fairly obvious, died in battle." So that was the entirely salutary jolt which I had 3 or 4 weeks ago. However, he was very careful to say he does not claim that he has found the site of the Battle of Brunanburh. The remains that he has discovered, he is not anxious for this to be widely publicised for very obvious reasons, but I understand they are in the region of Staunton, some way away from the traditional location of the battle at Bromborough. And he is also going to bring out a book on this subject called Wirral's Waterloo, suggesting what we can deduce and we cannot deduce from the archaeological remains, the 10th century remains, which he and his team of archaeologists have been finding up there in the northwest. The question is obviously one that's going to demand a considerable amount of examination, archaeological, linguistic, and so on, before the honours rest with one side or with the other. Now, there is at least one person in this room who knows more about Old English than all but a very few other people in the world, and therefore perhaps I ought to say a little bit, I ought to inflict a little bit of Anglo-Saxon philology upon you. Because there are two problems, one in Anglo-Saxon and one in Middle Irish, relating to the site of the battle. There is a notorious crux in the poem which refers to how the Vikings escaped, the wreck of the Viking army escaped over, what is it now, on Dinges Mera, over deep water, etc. The remains of the force, the wreckage of the army, etc., made their escape. They sought Dublin on Dinges Mera, over deep water, and so on. But over deep water is over deep water, so there's no problem about that. But Dinges Mera has been the knottiest of cruxes for editors of the poem over the last 300 and more years. And I spent considerably more than the 5 minutes which A.E. Housman says should be enough to solve so many problems. I think 20 or 25 minutes. And then Dinges Mera, something seemed to dawn, a line of poetry, a line from the modern poet W.H. Auden, who in his collection of the year 1930 gave us the splendid line, "O doom is dark and deeper than any sea dingle." And if you look up sea dingle in the great Oxford English Dictionary, you will see this is the first attestation of this form, an abyss of the sea, a cavern within the sea, since it was used in Sauliswada sometime in the early 13th century. There is a 700-year gap between the previous attestation and the second attestation. Through having done Old English and Middle English at Oxford, Auden was familiar with this line, and he took from this rather obscure Middle English religious text to make a sonorous line within his own poetry. And dingle does the trick. We need to make a textual emendation. Instead of Dinges Mera, which makes no sense, although some have attempted to associate it with the town of Thingwall in the Wirral. The members of the English Place Name Society have written articles saying Dingersmere is the space of sea related to Thingwall, which is a village within the Wirral. I think this is nonsense. I think this is baloney and so on. I think put in a letter and we have light, though not, I hope, heat. When the poet said Dinglers, Mera, the sea of the abyss, not only was he saying what he says in the next line, over the Deoba water, over the deep ocean, he is actually alluding to Psalm 36 in the Vulgate edition, line 7. The judgments of God are deep as the abyss of the sea. The poet of the Battle of Brunanburh was most certainly a cleric, was most certainly a monk who knew his psalms off by heart. I put it to you, this emendation makes sense of a half-line which has perplexed so many scholars where there has been no sense. After a bit of Old English, a touch of Irish. In the Annals of Clonmacnoise, which is a 17th century English translation of early modern Irish annals, the Irish original is lost, there is a reference to the battle as having taken place on the plains of Athlin. This again has been contrived in various ways and so on. People have related it to Lyme, Ashton under Lyme in Lancashire, for an identification of the battle site as being on the Cheshire Plain. Once again, a little investigation of the sources suggests a totally different response. If you go to the contributions to a dictionary of the Irish language, published by the Royal Irish Academy, you will find in another early modern Irish text the expression Otherlin, which means pools of sickness, lake of affliction, which is an Irish rhetorical way of referring to a battlefield. When the Annals of Clonmacnoise say the battle took place on the plains of Athlin, this is a corruption for Otherlin, and it tells us nothing about where it was at all. It is a purely rhetorical expression. The battle took place in a situation where there was carnage and so on. It is no evidence for situating the battle in Cheshire or County Durham or anywhere else. And with that, I think, I have come to the end of my case and so on. And I leave it to you. I may be right, I may be wrong, but if I were right, then we may rewrite all the books of Anglo-Saxon history. We may see more closely the events of that great day in 937. The archaeologists may also find useful material by investigation of this site on this old road up into Scotland, site of Scottish armies moving south and English armies moving north, both of them with invasion in their mind. Right. To finish off, I would like to have what Sir Thomas Beecham, an equivalent to what Sir Thomas Beecham and his consorts used to call lollipops, and so on. Short events at the end, which are not material directly to the main corpus of what we've been going through today, but which I hope will show you, in a similar way, how philology can come to the aid of historians and archaeologists in the investigation of our early history. St. Patrick, that noble Briton, was born, as he tells us himself, in the town, or close to the town, his villa was close to the town of Banawenta, Burni, etc., and nobody has ever known where that was, although Professor Charles Thomas has made strenuous efforts to locate it in the vicinity of Carlisle, in what became the later Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Bernicia. Let me put briefly to you an observation. In the 1960s, the Austrian scholar Ludwig Bieler, based at University College Dublin, amended this form, which makes no sense as it stands, to Banawenta, which would be good British Latin for market town by a hill or market town by a ridge, and the second element, Burni, which is meaningless, to Taburni, which is very meaningful because it means of a tavern, of an inn. The marketplace by the hill with a tavern. Those of you who know the Acts of the Apostles will remember how St. Paul, before he arrived at Rome, stopped at the place Tres Taverni, the three taverns on the road from Naples to Rome. It was argued by Harry Jelly, a local scholar in Yeovil, that this Banawenta Taburni is none other than Banwell, which is about 6 miles inland from western Supermare. Those of you expert in the history of Britain in the 5th century, I hope, will agree that Somerset, where there was a plenitude of villas, where there was urban life close at hand at Bath, but where the coast, being low in northern Somerset, was dangerously open to attack by Irish pirates, was the likely site for Patrick's first years and his tragic kidnapping by the Irish. Not by my hands, but by scholars who have come before me, I think we can solve definitively the location of St. Patrick. He was a Somerset man. He was living by the plains of Somerset in the early 5th century. And there is a picture of Banwell, and Banwell, I disagree totally, or I disagree in part with the etymology given in the Cambridge Dictionary of English place names. Ban is certainly the Celtic word for a ridge. You can see the ridge running, traces, I think, of a hill fort not too far away. The notion that, given by Margaret Gelling, a former fellow of the Society, in the Cambridge Dictionary, the first element means poison, and therefore it means poison well which was likely to poison you. I think that's preposterous, because basically if the well there had been poisonous, well, people would not have been so foolish as to live there. The element ban is Celtic. Banwell, in part, reproduces the Banawenta we know of from St. Patrick's text. A few other examples. Another notorious crux in the text of Bede is the Battle of Massafelth, where in 642 King Oswald of Northumbria met his doom. He was beheaded. The barbarous King Penda of Mercia exposed the head and hands on posts by the main road until they were recovered by a posse of Northumbrian troops who went to recover the relics of their king. The books, if they locate Massafelth anywhere, put it at Oswestry in the north of Shropshire. Again, the late Margaret Gelling, fellow of the Society, was strenuous and completely right in denying Oswestry's claims to be the location of that battle. A little thought on its whereabouts using Welsh evidence allows us to push it about 30 miles south, just near the town, just near the village of Horden, just inside Wales, just inside the former Montgomeryshire, the former, which is now Powys, not far from Offa's Dyke, which needless to say did not exist at the time, and to the right of Offa's Dyke you can see Castle Nunn. That, for those of you who are familiar with the Welsh material, that is the Cogwe, the rock of Boyer, under which the battle is known in the Welsh annals and other sources. Those of you concerned with battlefield archaeology, if you devote your attentions to the Roman road running east-west from Wroxeter to the centre of Wales in the vicinity of Fordon, you may be richly rewarded by the remains of a crucial Anglo-Saxon battle. Let me give you one last one. Perhaps the most notorious of all cruxes relating to battlefields in early English literature is the Obsessio Montis Bardonici of Gildas, and after him of Bede's Ecclesiastical History, where the Britons at some date in about 490 defeated the Saxons and established some 50 years of peace. Now, Scholars have been guessing at the whereabouts of Mount Badon, which of course was later associated with none other than King Arthur himself, his last great victory. Scholars have been doing this since Geoffrey of Monmouth, 900 years ago, who, without the slightest concern for philology, established for his own certainty that Badon was none other than Bath. And this is an error that has had a very long history. It is still repeated now, but not by anybody who knows anything about English philology, or indeed philology of any kind whatsoever. But once again, asked about this question, I looked at it and I thought, well, one thing you can say about Badon is that in terms of Celtic philology, it is completely meaningless. Even the great Kenneth Jackson of Edinburgh University never extracted any meaning from Badon. Once again, though, as with Inglesmere, a single letter will make a world of difference. Because some 14 years ago, Professor Richard Coates, Fellow of the Society, discussed Bradon in north-west Wiltshire, which you can just see here, yes, in the green, that sort of green tongue going in. That is the parish of Bradon, formerly an area heavily wooded. Everyone accepts it as a Celtic form, and he suggested that the meaning here is place of treachery. Brad is Welsh for treason or treachery and so on. He thought because the wood there was basically a den of thieves, and anybody travelling on the Roman road towards Cirencester, 8 miles difference, was liable to attack from the thieves who lurked within. Looking at Bradon, I thought, let us change Obsessio Montis Badonici to Obsessio Montis Bradonici, and it will make some sense. And just above Bradon, there is hilly land, there is the village of Parton, and within Parton there is Ringsbury Camp, an Iron Age hill fort. We have a picture of it from the air. You see the land falling away to the west and also to the south. I put it to you that this Iron Age hill fort was where a crucial battle was fought between Britons and Saxons about the year 40, about the year 9, about the year 490, and if your imagination chooses to range upon it, this was the greatest and last and most crucial victory of none other than King Arthur. Our time is up. My 45 minutes have passed. We may look about ourselves and see whether the world really has changed, or whether it is really pretty much the same as it was when I started speaking to you at 5:10.
Thank you very much indeed. You offered us philological hot potato. I think you've offered us mischievously quite a few hot potatoes, if not lollipops. You also promised us controversy, and I suspect you might have aroused a bit of that too. So I'd very much like to take some questions.
Hello, thank you. David Griffiths. I welcome your interest in the Battle of Brunanburh, and I think it's a very interesting problem. Having said that, I'm afraid I find your case almost completely unconvincing.
People have with that before.
I come to this not as a native of the Wirral, which I am, in fact, because I also lived in County Durham, quite near Brownie for 10 years when I was a student at Durham University, so my loyalty to split. I come to it really with merely the hope that we might get to the truth eventually, archaeologically, historically, or otherwise. You glided over the fact that Lanchester is called Lanchester and not Lanbury. There is a significant issue with the use of Bur and Castra, Ceasta, appended to these names. And I'm not the person to answer that, I'm not a philologist, but they simply can't be exchanged one for the other without making any case for that. Having said that, Brunanburh does, as you said, remain the best match with Bromborough. That's the only thing we've got to go on, is the place name really. Everything else is circumstantial evidence. Circumstantially, Bromborough works out reasonably well in my opinion, although I would not die in the ditch for it if another convincing alternative came along. It has many of the geopolitical attributes that one would expect with that battle. The escape over the sea. It's a narrow defile through the Dibbin Valley from the creek Bromborough Pool off the River Mersey. There's no reason at all why the Scottish Army shouldn't have been there. For a start, they were allied with the Vikings, which makes it a special case, if you like, an unusual case for them. Secondly, yes, they could use roads to get south. Just because Lanchester is nearer to Scotland makes no difference at all. You mentioned 45, but of course came as far south as Derby on that occasion. So just because Bromborough is further south, that doesn't make a lot of difference in my view. And Mr. France, I'm afraid, is responsible only for his own excavations. He's not responsible for excavations in Wirral. And I personally would not set very great store, if I can use pun with Staunton, by his claims to have found that rather supports your case, actually, I must say. Having said that, there is a project happening at the moment, a community archaeological project run by a former student of mine who studied for a Masters at Oxford University, and he is running an excavation at the site of Bromborough Courthouse, which is a very, very interesting site with some tremendously powerful earthworks around it. We're yet to get to the bottom of those, it's early days, but there is some potential there, I think, for some really useful archaeological resolution. I think we should keep looking. And for me, I'm afraid the world has stayed very much the same as it was 3/4 of an hour ago, but thank you anyway.
I have a very great connection with the Fort of Lanchester. Some years ago, I produced a geophysical survey of the entire interior, an astonishing piece of work. I said myself, because the results were so good that you could enter individual rooms of the barrack blocks buried below the turf of the fort. The fort's history is in the hands of the Greenwood family, and it was a Greenwood in the early 19th century who fashioned the interior of the fort. Up to that time, the buildings were standing above ground up to lintel level on windows, according to the accounts of the present owner of the site. The fact that the walls also survive to this day, in part to 9 feet high, makes it a formidable piece of defence at any period. I wouldn't expect it to be the site where anyone would fight pitch battle if they could take refuge in a very considerably complete fort. The second point I'd like to make is that I'm not too sure whether the road that goes up there is actually the major Roman road north, which to my mind is the one that goes through Chesterfield Street and heads for Adrian's Wall. The other thing I wonder is, when did the Brownie get its name?
Is there an Anglo-Saxon historian in the house? No? Yes? Okay. Well, I might be putting my foot in it. But my recollection is that Athelstan, on his way to Brunanburh, stopped off at Chesterfield Street to give gifts to the shrine of St. Cuthbert there to enable him to gain victory in the battle, which he then did. Now, that suggests to me that unless he was doing an awful lot of zigzagging around the country, the battle is somewhere on the eastern side. Now, I'm not saying I agree necessarily with Andrew, but it seems to me this is something that nobody has actually looked at, particularly in the context of this, of the Battle of Brunanburh. And so I'm really quite interested in Lanchester, not indeed on the main road north from Chester. But nevertheless, not that far away. I guess that's one.
to know a little more about the use of the word bingo in earlier English.
Right, Andrew, over to you, I think.
Right, well, I'll deal with the questions in reverse order. On the uses of the word dingle, I can refer you only to the Oxford English Dictionary and to, obviously, the English Placement Society's dictionaries of placement elements. Placement elements in the English landscape. I believe it is attested elsewhere in Old English. I know that I have a note on this somewhere in the text. I think if you go to the dictionary of Old English, it is attested in Old English. It is certainly attested in very early Middle English and so on. So it's a standard word. Though it is not, I think, the word used to gloss the particular SAL in the Vespasian Psalter gloss and so on, etc. Different words are used to gloss the word for chasm, abyss, in this particular Old Testament text. Now, the whole question about the manuscript is a very interesting one, because this is, I think, manuscript 183 at Corpus Christi College, Cambridge, which is famous, making an inept attempt to find a picture of the presentation of the manuscript to St. Cuthbert by King Athelstan, and failing completely, but no matter. This is one of the most famous presentation pieces of Old English, for the manuscripts of the Old English period, and so on. And I have written a paper which I've sent off to a Cambridge journal who are chewing over it, because the historians of Chesterfield Street and Durham later on had no doubt whatsoever that Athelstan won his victory because of the aid of St. Cuthbert, and so on. And they make references to the king's devotion to Cuthbert, and so on, and Cuthbert favoured the victor's cause, and so on. And I argue, reverse what the question suggested. I don't think he gave the manuscript to the monks before he fought battle. I think he gave it to them in gratitude a few months later. And if you look at the chronology of the production of the manuscript, probably at Glastonbury, about 5 or 6 years before the battle was fought, you'll find a discussion of this in Michael Lavage's enormous recent book published in Toronto on a catalogue of all the manuscripts known to have come from Anglo-Saxon England. Well, I disagree with Michael Lavage's dating. I think we can actually put it in a much narrower frame, because it seems to me that the manuscript was finished and was a presentation piece to the monks of Chester Street, because the battle was fought in their backyard, and therefore Athelstan had the very best possible reasons for being grateful to St. Cuthbert and very grateful to the monks who were devoted to Cuthbert and possessed his body. So I think my location of this battle in Durham fits with the known history of this famous Anglo-Saxon manuscript of the Gospels. Now, the earlier questions on the Brownie. The Brownie is not attested until the early Middle English period, but there is indeed a very good reason why we do not have early attestations of the name of Brunanburh, because of course the 4 counties in northern England do not appear in Domesday Book, and therefore they are Cinderellas in comparison with the rest of England and so on. But I would say to the question about the fort, I cannot comment on this, although I do think the battle was an extended one. I think that battlefield historians have said to me they can think of instances where a battle fought by a vanguard, an army that is in retreat, evidence for it. This is particular with reference to the battle in which Carwatan of Gwynedd was defeated near Hexham in the early 630s. The battlefield archaeologists said to me they found debris from the Northumbrian army extending from Heavenfield, just north of Hadrian's Wall, right down to Rowley Water, some 6 miles away, where the victory was obtained. So I wouldn't be too fixated on the Roman fort as necessarily the crux of where events were going on. But archaeology may cast light on this and so on. Now, before that, I think we have the whole business about place names. Well, of course, we like to think place names are fixed and certain. Unfortunately, you don't need to do much more than consult Eckford's Oxford Dictionary of English Place Names or the new Victor Watts Cambridge Dictionary of English Place Names to see that many places have existed under a variety of forms in the early period. I was looking at the history of Rochdale the other day. We knew Rochdale as Rochdale, but in the earliest attestation it appears as Wreckingham and so on. Only later does the form Wrekin-dara become fixed. Places change their names. Some places change their names in the most startling way. The town we know as Derby was known as Derryworth, Deerworthy, the place, the habitation, the settlement of the deer to the Anglo-Saxons. We know Peterborough as Peterborough, but the Anglo-Saxons knew it as, if I remember rightly, Meadisborough, and so on. Place names now are pretty fixed, but they certainly weren't fixed in their form, or indeed even in their very nature in early medieval times and so on. So the question we have Lanchester, that Lanchester should have replaced Brunanburh, bothers me not in the slightest. And so I could quote a great many instances of places where we have a completely different modern name, but there's no doubt about the identity of the early name. And then just to finish all this off and so on, the business of Scottish invasions. Well, I'm not a military historian, but I should certainly, as I've said before, like to know of another instance in which a Scottish army returned home by sea, and not on all those tried and tested Roman roads. If there's such an instance, I should very much like to know it, because it may materially modify the argument that I've been putting forward to you this evening.
Thank you very much indeed, Andrew. Well, you've clearly stimulated a lot of interest, which is great. This is what we're about as a society, raising points of interest and discussing them. I'm sure the discussion will go on after we've all left and over a sherry. I hope you will have an opportunity to pursue some of these issues more, because there's clearly a lot of things to think about. It's very good to be reminded of the importance of philology and place name evidence. I think obviously there is a challenge with corroborating with other forms of evidence, which is clearly what has interested us here. But clearly this battle was a very important one, as you said, 10th century Battle of Hastings. It's good to be reminded of the importance of this battle, and I see the challenge and interest in understanding exactly how it took place, where it was, rather more. So I think we wish you very well in your research. I'd be very interested to see how this progresses in the wider world of Anglo-Saxon research. So thank you very much indeed.